high-profile discussions on cross-border partnerships, agri-business, industrial revolution, and of course sustainable development were just a few that marked the second edition of the Africa 2017 Investment Summit, which took place in Egypt. I'm Onyi Sunday, and you're watching highlights from the Africa 2017 Summit in Egypt. According to a 2014 report on Africa's position in global trade, the continent's share of global export stands at 2.4%, while sub-Saharan Africa's accounts for 1.7% of that figure. If Africa is to record any form of improvement, there are calls for better regional integration on the continent.
Actually, I want to mention we just finished the presidential breakout. And one of the points that they have emphasized all along is that the African countries have to agree on the points of strength of each and every country in order to reach an integration among the different African countries. And the president has called on the private sector to assist the governments in this respect and try to point out to the governments what are the points of strength that each African country does entertain in order to reach completion and integration.
For an improvement in intra-regional trade or world trade to take place, African countries must have commodities to exchange.
To modernize our backbone economy, agriculture, into industrialization, manufacturing is the linking and the bridge to transform the one.
What we have really confused many times is industrialization with manufacturing. Of course they are related, but it's not the same. You can industrialize with very little manufacturing within it. But industrialization is about economic structures that are completely different from the previous periods in time. If we are going to be able to capture some of the potential of the new technologies, it's very difficult for us to bypass completely industrialization.
As simple as the formula may sound, the infrastructure deficit across the continent remains a major obstacle.
What is the impediment of trade, of cross-border trading in African continent is infrastructure. Infrastructure is the basis for anything. Infrastructure, also energy in that infrastructure. Today, we know that 698 million people do not have access to basic sanitary facilities and clean drinking water on our continent. 620 million people do not have access to electricity. The entire continent of Africa has as much electricity as Spain. A country like Nigeria, 200 million people, has as much electricity as New York City. This is very shameful.
According to Timothy McPherson Jr., the Minister of Finance, Akopong, Jamaica, the solution to Africa's major challenge lies in its integration.
The question that we have to ask ourselves is, what part of the economy do we have in common? Because we have to work in a sphere of commonality. And obviously from a Caribbean perspective and from a Sunbelt region perspective, we've come to realize that the greatest area of commonality between continental Africa and the diaspora is the sun, which shines 365 days a year in our Sunbelt region communities. And that means that in this time and age where we are confronted with climate change, and at the same time have this phenomenal knowledge of renewable energy and how to use the sun as a means for producing our energy, so we could kind of wean ourselves off of our addiction to fossil fuels and embrace renewables. We've taken the stance that renewable energy in general and solar energy in particular will be the sphere of engagement for which the diaspora engages the continent.
Africa requires over $90 billion to address its infrastructure deficit and will require the input of the private sector to plug this shortfall. Eliminating barriers to investment in the continent was discussed at the summit.
The GDP of Africa representing 5% of the total GDP of the world. But Africa receiving only 3.3% of the total capital inflow compared to the rest of the world. This is around 59 billion US dollar. But if we really would like to make a match between the size of the African economy and the expected capital inflow to Africa, we should talk about $100 billion. So there is a strong gap between the size of the economy and the inflow coming to the African continent.
One of the fundamental obstacles is that the African countries fundamentally are different in terms of the legal systems. And this stems from the fact, of course, of the historical background and the presence of certain countries like Britain, France, Portugal, so forth. So the legal systems in Africa do vary from one country to the other. And accordingly, they're unable to treat Africa as one unit. So perhaps we ought to consider what the European Union has done in this respect in having laws and regulations that are being done at the level of the continent itself, different than the domestic laws and regulations.
The real problem, in my view, is one, information. There's a huge lack of information between Africans, and we've seen that at Luxembourg. We've seen situations, for example, where a bank in country A would not be willing to accept the risk of a neighboring bank in country B, just because they simply do not have information about it, right? It's not, there's no issue of risk at all, you know. It's an issue of perception and lack of information.
While the debate on a single currency for the African continent is ongoing, Isabel dos Santos, chair of Unitel Angola, says the solution may not lie in a single currency.
I don't think we necessarily need a single currency. I don't think that's necessary, but definitely an integration between our central banks. Our central banks need to start talking to each other. Currently, they're not. They need to find a way, to find a platform where they integrate a payment system, where you can actually convert currencies from one country to another without going through a third barter currency like the euro or like the yen or like the dollar.
To further support the essence of the summit aimed at promoting regional integration, the Egyptian Export Bank and Afrexim Bank signed a financial agreement aimed at promoting export in Egypt.
We are pleased to be collaborating with the Export Development Bank of Egypt to put in place an export support scheme for Egypt in an amount of $500 million. The facility will refinance and rediscount financing provided to exporters by Export Development Bank of Egypt as well as other Egyptian banks.
Export Development Bank's customer base, as it exists now, is already 75% exporters who rely on our bank to address their challenges. And in order to penetrate and grow their business into Africa, they are faced with three main challenges: access to finance, mitigating sovereign and commercial risk, awareness of the African markets and its needs. Accordingly, the major objective of the scheme we are signing today is to help tackle and resolve all these challenges.
To further develop human capacity, Egypt's Ministry of Education also signed an MOU with Regent University in South Africa.
This is an important university in South Africa. They are teaching business and management and finance. I think it's a good opportunity for intercultural dialogue between Africa and Africa, the North and the South. So we're looking forward next year to start business in this school. We're expecting to have around 7,000 students by the first couple of years.
Egypt has also embarked on a number of initiatives aimed at attracting investment into the country.
Egypt has made major milestones in economic reforms. So President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has spearheaded a bold and very ambitious and far-reaching economic reform program. One main pillar of that was improving the business environment, and we've been working on legislative and operationalization of these new laws. So we have the new investment laws that have cut red tape, streamlined procedures, and got rid of a lot of bureaucracy that the country was suffering from. We've also provided tax incentives and non-tax incentives to attract investment.
China, Africa's #1 trade partner and biggest infrastructure financier, is no doubt Africa's biggest investment partner today. This session aimed to examine the new China under its president Xi Jinping and how best Africa can position itself to harness the opportunities its partnership with Africa presents.
First, I would say actually, instead of talking about China-Africa strategy, I think we should talk about Africa-China strategy. We need to put Africa in the center. Why? Because today, I think Africa have a choice. You can choose the partnership, whether you work with Europe, whether to work with US, and whether to work with China. It is Africa's choice today. You've got a choice. But China is offering you a choice, because China has been making the choice for ourselves.
In an exclusive chat, Helen Hai, the CEO of Made in Africa Initiative China, said it's time for Africa to walk the talk.
I think Africa need to develop your own policy, but you need to learn what actually the best from both worlds. If you ask me to summarize the different approach, the Western approach has been given to Africa and the Chinese approach. I have this kind of tiger analysis. If you have a tiger in front of you, the traditional Western approach telling Africa, when you have the tiger in front of you, what do? You get your laptop, analyze the characteristic carefully of the tiger, and then discuss with your colleague, how are you going to conquer the tiger? The problem is this approach, when you finish that analysis or study, the tiger might be gone. You are probably being eaten by the tiger. The Chinese approach is very different. If they have a tiger in front of them, they jump on top of the tiger, they ride it.
From discussions at the Egypt 2017 summit, it is clear that the time for Africa to act is now.
Knowing that the digital revolution is accelerating things, we are in an exponential curve of transformation. Therefore, we do not have time, since the next 5 years will change the world, our countries included, more than the last 50 years. And if you continue the same reasoning, the next 10 or 15 years will change the world as much as the last 1,000 years. So we need to be aware of that. Since when you are aware of that, you should, specifically in our countries and African countries, we should not reinvent the wheel. We should pick up on what is good in one country, implement it, adapt it, and move on.
Africa 2017 welcomed more than 1,500 delegates from 105 countries, representing a wide variety of sectors and industries. During the 3 days, the forum hosted 6 heads of state and various senior officials, all showing their engagement to strengthen intra-Africa trade and cooperation, and recognizing the importance of the private sector to do so. And on that note, we draw the curtains on this year's edition of the Africa 2017 Investment Summit, which took place in Sham El Sheikh, Egypt. I'm Onyi Sunday. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye. But as they say in Egypt, Marcela.